The galaxy is a battlefield of power, betrayal, and unthinkable secrets. On Orion 9, a forgotten space station clinging to the edge of nowhere, Victor, a mechanic with a past he can't remember, stumbles into a deadly arena. What begins as an ordinary day repairing ships becomes a life-or-death fight against Lyra, the fierce Cormoran warrior. But when his unexpected power surges in a fight he never asked for, it will change everything he thought he knew about himself. Will Victor survive the chaos, or will the universe's most dangerous enemies tear him apart? The truth will unravel, and so will his fate, when the stars themselves choose sides. Intrigued? Want to see how this story unfolds? Hit that subscribe button and join us on this wild ride through space, power, and untold mysteries. You won't want to miss what happens next. Subscribe now and be part of the adventure. The galaxy churned like a storm with no end, a sprawling void where power-hungry species vied for control. Telepaths twisted thoughts, gravity shapers warped orbits, and cunning traders bartered secrets, all clashing in uncharted territories littered with shattered moons and dying suns. Orion 9 hung in this frenzy, a battered space station tethered to a lifeless asteroid. It was a hive of activity, gruff voices haggling over fuel cells, the clatter of boots on steel decks, the hiss of plasma torches slicing through scrap. A haze of exhaust clung to the air, pierced by the sharp tang of molten metal and the faint glow of jury-rigged lights swaying overhead. Across this restless expanse shimmered Cormoran, a world of jagged peaks and thundering skies. Its warriors, women with skin like polished jade, were forged in battle, their lives ruled by a code older than the stars. Strength wasn't just a virtue, it was their heartbeat. Honor demanded they bow only to those who could defeat them in combat, a tradition etched in stone and blood. No alien had ever dared test it, let alone succeed. The very notion felt absurd, like a comet reversing its course mid-flight. On Cormoran, defeat meant more than shame. It was a bond, a vow to serve the victor, unbroken for generations. Victor barely registered the universe's grand struggles. His days unfolded in a cramped nook on Orion 9, a hideaway wedged between leaking conduits and flickering power boxes. His workbench overflowed with oddities, a dented spudger, a coil of frayed wire, a half-melted flux capacitor he'd salvaged from a wrecked freighter. He was the station's go-to-fix-it guy, elbows deep in grease, coaxing life back into engines others had given up on. The clamor of drunken brawls and haggling merchants drifted past his door, but he tuned it out, focusing on the steady buzz of his soldering iron. He scratched at a smudge on his forearm, peering at a flickering gauge, while the station's hull creaked under the strain of another passing ship. Victor didn't stand out in Orion 9's sea of drifters. He was human, or so he assumed, with hands scarred from years of prying apart stubborn gears and a gaze that lingered a little too long on nothing. His past was a blank slate, a fog he'd stumbled out of when he landed here, armed only with a knack for repairs and a battered hollow device. That device held the Celestial Chronicles, a collection of tales about a mythic lineage wielding powers that defied logic, shaping storms, shattering steel with a glance. He'd scoff at the wilder bits, but something about the stories stuck with him, like an itch he couldn't scratch. He spent his nights hunched in his corner, the hollow's faint blue light dancing across his features. A busted thruster lay dissected before him, its innards spilling out as he probed with a thin probe, muttering about shoddy welds. Every so often, a jolt would hit, a spike of pain behind his eyes, sharp enough to make him wince. Visions flickered with it, a sky ablaze, a shadowed figure reaching out, a name he couldn't catch. He'd blink them away, chalking it up to fatigue, and dive back into his work, the whir of a drill filling the silence. The station's dim hum kept him company as he flipped a page on the hollow, smirking at a line about a hero accidentally torching his own camp. A scar traced a faint arc across his chest, barely visible under his worn shirt. He'd spotted it once in the cracked reflection of a coolant tank, puzzled but unbothered. Probably some old scrape, he figured. Yet there were moments when a job went sour or a tool slipped that his temper flared. His fist would tighten, knuckles whitening, and once he'd crushed a bolt in his grip without trying. He'd stare at the mangled metal, brow furrowed, then tossed it into a pile with a grunt. Right now, he was wrestling with a jammed relay, prying at it with a pair of pliers. The hollow glowed beside him, casting a tale of a warrior discovering a gift he never knew he carried, while Victor cursed under his breath at a stubborn wire. Victor shuffled past the public arena on Orion 9, his boots dragging against the worn metal floor, eyes glued to the flickering hollow device in his hands. The Celestial Chronicles had him hooked. A warrior in the tale had just botched a grand entrance by slipping on a puddle of engine sludge, and Victor couldn't hold back a loud, barking laugh. It echoed through the corridor, sharp and careless. He didn't notice the hush that fell over the place, the way every head in the grimy stand swiveled toward the center of the pit. Down there, Lyra stood over a toppled giant, his armor cracked like an eggshell under a last blow. The crowd watched in reverent silence, barely breathing. She was Cormoran's pride, a vision of lethal grace. Her jade-hued skin caught the arena's stark lights, glinting with every shift of her stance, while her black hair lashed the air like a storm. Those golden eyes burned, fierce and unyielding, as she rested one foot on the defeated Hulk's chest. The guy had been massive, 7 feet of muscle and metal plating, but she'd dropped him without breaking a sweat. Victor, oblivious, chuckled again, thumbing the hollow to reread the sludge bit. That's when her gaze snapped up, locking onto him like a targeting beam. The air turned heavy as she strode forward, her boots striking the ground with a crisp, deliberate clang. "You dare laugh at me?" Her voice cut through the stillness, icy and edged with venom. Victor jolted, nearly dropping the device, his head jerking up to meet her stare. "What? No," he sputtered, waving the hollow like a shield. "It's not you. I'm laughing at this. Guy slipped in sludge, it's dumb." She didn't blink, her eyes narrowing as she sized him up. No armor, no blade, just a lanky figure in a faded jacket smeared with grease stains. He looked about as threatening as a busted fuel pump. Her lips twitched, a flicker of disdain curling them. "You mock my victory with your noise?" He scratched his jaw, shifting under the weight of her glare and the crowd's stifled snickers. "I wasn't even paying attention," he mumbled, nodding toward the pit. "Didn't see a thing." Before he could backtrack, a synthetic voice blared from the arena speakers. Challenge accepted. Combatant registered. A chorus of gasps erupted, and Victor's mouth fell open. "Hold on, what?" He spun, scanning the stands for some sign of a glitch, but a shimmering energy wall flared up behind him, sealing him inside with her. Lyra tilted her head, arms folding across her chest, her sheathed sword gleaming at her hip. "You've stepped into my domain, stranger," she said, her tone a blade unsheathed. "Laugh all you want. Prove it's worth something." Victor gaped, stuffing the hollow into his pocket as it pinged with a line about the sludge-soaked warrior begging for mercy. "This is insane," he muttered, hands flapping uselessly. "I fix stuff. I don't fight. Can't we just call this a mix-up?" Her smirk didn't waver, but something flickered in those golden eyes. Anger, sure, but a spark of intrigue, too. He was nothing like her usual challengers. No swagger, no scars, just a puzzled guy who'd stumbled into the wrong place. "Mix-up or not," she replied, stepping nearer, her breath a faint mist in the chilled air. "You're here now. Face me or slink away." The crowd jeered, a hungry rumble rolling through the tiers, eager for spectacle. Victor rubbed his neck, glancing around the pit. "I don't even have a weapon," he said, patting his pockets as if he'd find a plasma cutter tucked away. Lyra's hand flicked to her sword, drawing it with a smooth hiss, its blade pulsing with a faint blue glow. "Then find one," she shot back, settling into a stance that screamed confidence. He stumbled back a step, his heel catching on a loose grate. The arena wasn't much help. Rusted pipes poked from the walls, A puddle of coolant glistened near the edge, and a discarded wrench lay half-buried in the dirt. His brain scrambled, not for battle, but for an exit. Voices swelled around them, a chaotic chant egging her on. Lyra paced a slow circle, her movements fluid, almost taunting, like a hunter sizing up a stray. Victor tugged at his jacket, muttering about glitchy tech and bad timing. The hollow buzzed again, spitting out a snippet about a hero facing doom with nothing but wits. He groaned, kicking at the ground, sending up a puff of dust as Lyra's silhouette edged closer, her sword catching the light with every measured step. Lyra paced the arena floor, her boots kicking up faint clouds of dust as Victor fumbled in front of her, still muttering about broken systems and bad luck. She was a living legend, Cormoran's unbreakable spear, her name whispered in awe across a dozen systems. Her skin shimmered like polished jade under the arena's glaring lights, catching every flicker and gleam, a stark contrast to the dull steel around her. Her frame was a perfect balance, lean muscle honed by years of combat, yet curved in ways that drew eyes even in the heat of battle. That cascade of black hair whipped around her shoulders with each step, wild and untamed, while her golden eyes glowed like twin embers, sharp enough to pierce through any defense. She gripped her sword, its energy blade humming faintly, a weapon that had felled countless foes over a decade without a single defeat. 10 years. 10 years of victories piled up behind her, each one carved out with reflexes so fast they blurred, strikes so precise they left no room for error. She'd faced brutes twice her size, assassins cloaked in shadow, even a rogue mech once, its circuits sizzling under her blade. None had lasted long. The crowd knew it. Those grubby faces in the stands, clutching their bets, staring down with a mix of fear and worship. To them, she was invincible, a force of nature forged on a planet where weakness was a death sentence. Cormoran didn't raise survivors. It bred warriors, and Lyra was the best of them, her every move a testament to that brutal legacy. But beneath the armor, beneath the pride that held her spine straight, something gnawed at her. She was tough, hard as the obsidian cliffs of her homeworld, but that hardness came with a quiet ache. She'd spent a decade cutting down challengers, proving herself again and again, yet none had ever pushed her to the edge. None had made her feel alive, not the way she imagined in those rare, unguarded moments when the cheers faded and the silence crept in. She was a machine to them, perfect, relentless, but she didn't want to be just that. Deep down, buried under layers of discipline and steel, she craved an equal, someone who could match her fire, who could crack the wall she'd built around herself and make her feel human again. Victor didn't look like that someone. She watched him now, this grease-stained off-worlder patting his pockets like he'd misplaced a wrench instead of facing a fight. "I fix stuff, not people," he grumbled, kicking at the dirt as if it'd cough up an excuse. Lyra tilted her head, her sword still poised, its glow casting jagged shadows across the pit. He was scrawny, all elbows and awkward angles, his jacket hanging loose on a frame that hadn't seen a proper meal in weeks. No scars marked his skin, no calluses of combat, just the rough hands of a tinkerer. She'd crushed better men in seconds, yet here he stood, caught in her ring by some glitch of fate. Her lips twitched, a smirk tugging at the corner. "You're wasting my time," she said, voice low, carrying that icy edge she'd perfected over years of command. The crowd hooted, eager for her to dismantle him, but she didn't move yet. Those golden eyes raked over him, searching for something, anything, that justified his presence here. He didn't even have a weapon, just that ridiculous hollow device he'd shoved away, its faint buzz still audible in his pocket. She'd seen fools before, challengers who thought bravado could carry them, but this one didn't even have that. He looked lost, like a stray who'd wandered into a predator's den. And yet, that laugh of his lingered in her mind. It had been loud, careless, cutting through her moment of triumph like a stray spark. She'd just dropped that hulking mercenary, his chest plate crumpled under her heel, and the station had gone quiet, every eye on her. Then came that sound, sharp and out of place, pulling her focus to this nobody. It stung, that casual dismissal, but it also stirred something. Curiosity, maybe, or irritation she couldn't shake. Was he really that clueless, or was there more to him? She'd fought enough liars to know a mask when she saw one, but his wide-eyed stammering didn't feel like an act. "You've got no steel, no spine," she said, stepping closer, her sword dipping slightly as she tested him. "What's a man like you doing in my fight?" Victor blinked up at her, hands half raised like he could ward her off with a shrug. "I'm telling you, it's a mistake," he insisted, voice cracking just enough to draw a few laughs from the stands. "I don't even know how to hold one of those." He nodded at her blade, then glanced around, spotting that rusty wrench half sunk in the dirt. Lyra followed his gaze, her smirk widening. "Pick it up," she ordered, her tone daring him to try. He hesitated, wiping sweaty palms on his jacket, then bent to grab the wrench, fumbling it once before getting a grip. It looked pitiful in his hand, a dull chunk of metal against her sleek, glowing weapon. The crowd jeered louder, a wave of noise crashing over them, but Lyra didn't strike yet. She shifted her weight, circling him again, her boots scuffing the ground as she watched his every twitch. Victor clutched the wrench tighter, muttering something about never signing up for this, while her shadow stretched across the pit, inching closer with every step. Lyra didn't give Victor a chance to catch his breath. She lunged, her energy sword slashing through the air like a streak of lightning, its blue glow leaving faint trails in the dim arena. The crowd roared, a tidal wave of noise crashing over the pit as she moved, fast, precise, a blur of jade skin and black hair. Victor stumbled back, clutching the rusty wrench he'd snatched from the dirt, his other hand fumbling with the hollow device still buzzing in his pocket. "Don't break my stuff," he yelped, ducking as her blade sliced inches above his head, the heat of it singeing a few stray hairs. The stands erupted in laughter, jeers raining down like sparks. Half the onlookers betting he'd be flat on his back in 10 seconds, the other half just enjoying the show. She was relentless, a storm in human form. Her sword darted again, a downward arc aimed at his shoulder, then a quick flick toward his ribs. Victor twisted, clumsy and wide-eyed, barely dodging each strike. His boots skidded on the gritty floor, kicking up dust as he waved the wrench like it might scare her off. "I'm not cut out for this," he shouted, voice cracking over the crowd's hoots. Lyra's golden eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight, feral grin. She'd seen panic before, challengers who crumbled under her speed. But this guy's flailing was almost comical, like a kid swatting at a swarm of bugs. Still, she pressed harder, her blade whistling as it carved a diagonal path toward his chest. He tripped over a loose grate, staggering to one knee, and the crowd howled louder, sensing the end. Lyra seized the moment, spinning into a final decisive strike, a thrust straight for his midsection, fast enough to end it clean. Victor's breath hitched, his arms flailing as he threw up the wrench in a desperate block. Metal met energy, a screeching clash ringing out, and the arena went quiet for a split second. Her sword should have sheared through that flimsy scrap like paper. It was rusted, brittle, barely a tool, let alone a weapon. But didn't. The blade stopped dead, locked against the wrench, sparks spitting where they met. Lyra's eyes widened, a jolt running through her as she pushed harder, expecting it to snap. It held. Victor's hand trembled, gripping the wrench, so tight his knuckles bleached white, but the metal didn't buckle. Then, with a grunt he didn't plan, he shoved back, hard. A surge of force rippled through him, raw and unfamiliar, like a switch flipping in his bones. Lyra stumbled, her boots sliding across the dirt, and before she could catch herself, she hit the ground, landing on one knee with a thud. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of air that sucked the noise right out of the pit. Victor blinked down at her, the wrench still clutched in his shaking fist, his chest heaving. His eyes flickered, a strange, fleeting glow like starlight caught in a mirror, then dimmed as quick as it came. She stared up at him, dust settling around her, her sword still humming in her grip. Shock twisted her features, sharp and unguarded, her breath catching in her throat. That wasn't supposed to happen. She'd fought warlords, machines, killers with twice his size and 10 times his grit. None had ever knocked her off balance, not like this. Anger flared next, hot and bitter, tightening her jaw as she glared at him. But beneath it, something else stirred, a grudging flicker of respect, faint but undeniable. He stood there, panting, looking as baffled as she felt, like he hadn't meant to do it. What was that?" he muttered, dropping the wrench with a clatter, his hands flexing as if they didn't belong to him. Lyra pushed to her feet, brushing dirt off her armor, her gaze never leaving him. The crowd buzzed again, whispers spreading like static, some calling it a fluke, others wondering if they'd missed something. She straightened, rolling her shoulders, and planted her sword tip first into the ground, leaning on it slightly. "According to Cormoran law," she said, her voice steady but laced with a bite, "I owe you a debt of honor." The words tasted sour, forced out through gritted teeth, but they hung heavy in the air. Inside, her mind raced. He wasn't normal. Not a mechanic, not some station rat. That strength, that flash in his eyes, it wasn't luck. She'd felt it, a pulse of something bigger, something he didn't even seem to grasp. Victor scratched his head, the hollow device chirping faintly in his pocket as he shuffled back a step. Debt? Wait, no, I didn't mean to. I don't want anything, he protested, hands waving like he could undo the whole mess. The crowd chuckled, a few jeers cutting through, but Lyra ignored them, stepping closer. Her boots crunched on the loose gravel, her armor glinting as she tilted her head, studying him again. He looked harmless. Messy hair, smudged jacket, a face still flushed with confusion. But she wasn't fooled. Not anymore. "You don't get to choose," she said, her tone flat, almost daring him to argue. "You won. Deal with it." He opened his mouth, then closed it, glancing at the wrench like it might explain itself. "I didn't win anything," he mumbled, kicking it aside with a dull clang. "That was just, I don't know, adrenaline or something." Lyra's smirk returned, faint but sharp, as she yanked her sword from the dirt, its glow pulsing once before she sheathed it. "Adrenaline," she echoed, her voice dripping with skepticism. She crossed her arms, the crowd's chatter fading into a low hum behind her, and took another step, closing the gap until she was close enough to see the sweat beading on his brow. Victor shifted, uncomfortable under her stare, and tugged at his collar, muttering about needing to check his tools after this. The hollow device pinged again, throwing up a random line about a hero stumbling into power he couldn't control. He swatted at his pocket to silence it, while Lyra's shadow stretched across the ground, her presence looming as she watched him fidget, her fingers tapping idly against her armored thigh. Lyra trailed Victor out of the arena, her boots clicking against the scuffed steel floor, her shadow stretching long and lean behind her. She'd lost, technically, and that debt of honor gnawed at her like a splinter under a nail. Cormoran law didn't bend, not even for her pride. So here she was, following this greasy mechanic back to his corner of Orionine. He shuffled ahead, still clutching that hollow device, muttering about dents in his wrench like it was the real victim. She kept pace, her golden eyes locked on him, sharp and unblinking, picking apart every move he made. That flash of strength in the pit, that impossible shove, it stuck in her head, a puzzle she couldn't leave unsolved. His workshop was a cramped cave tucked between groaning pipes and flickering conduits, a mess of tools and tangled wires spilling across a battered bench. Victor tossed his jacket onto a hook, missing by a mile, and plopped onto a stool, already poking at a sparking relay with a thin probe. Lyra lingered near the doorway, arms crossed, her armor catching the dim light as she watched him. He didn't notice her at first, too busy cursing a stripped bolt under his breath. She stepped closer, her presence filling the tight space, until she was right behind him, close enough to catch the faint whiff of solder and sweat clinging to his shirt. He turned to grab a spanner and nearly bumped into her, jolting back with a startled grunt. "Whoa, place is tight," he said, his voice low and rough, scraping the quiet. Her gaze flicked down to his hands. Those same hands that had stopped her sword, now fiddling with a rusty tool like nothing had happened. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, her breath steady but her mind buzzing. "Tight or not," she said, her tone cool and edged. "I'm here." He glanced up, brow furrowing, then shrugged and went back to the relay, oblivious to the weight of her stare. She couldn't shake it, that flicker of something in him, raw and unpolished, like a blade buried in dirt. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was a pull, a strange itch she didn't know how to scratch. Victor hunched over his work, muttering about voltage spikes, his fingers deft despite the chaos around him. Lyra shifted her weight, her boot nudging a stray bolt across the floor, her eyes tracing the line of his arm as he twisted a wire into place, the hum of the station fading into the background. Victor twisted the wire tighter, the relay sparking under his fingers, while Lyra loomed nearby, her silence louder than the station's usual racket. She hadn't said much since they'd left the arena, just watched him, those golden eyes cutting through the dimness like searchlights. He tried to ignore her, focusing on the familiar rhythm of his tools, but the air felt thicker with her around. Then it happened. A deep, shuddering boom rocked Orion 9, the kind that rattled your teeth and sent a shiver up your spine. The lights flickered, plunging the workshop into a strobe of shadows, and a klaxon blared overhead, shrill and insistent. "Reactor breach," a robotic voice droned. "Evacuate! Evacuate!" He dropped the spanner, cursing as it clattered to the floor. "That's not good," he muttered, scrambling to his feet. Lyra was already moving, her sword drawn in a flash, its blue glow slicing through the dark. "Stay behind me," she snapped, voice clipped and commanding, but before they could reach the door, the ceiling groaned, a jagged crack splitting it open. A chunk of steel plating, big as a crate and twice as heavy, tore free, plummeting straight for them. Victor reacted without thinking, shoving Lyra aside and throwing up his arms. His hands caught the slab mid-fall, the weight slamming into him, but he didn't buckle. He held it, muscles straining, a faint shimmer flickering in his eyes before fading fast. Lyra hit the floor with a grunt, rolling to her knees, her sword skittering a few feet away. She stared up at him, jaw slack, as he stood there, chest heaving, the massive hunk of metal trembling in his grip. "Ow!" she started, but he cut her off with a strained groan, shoving the slab aside. It crashed into the workbench, scattering tools in a chaotic spray. "No idea," he panted, flexing his hands like they betrayed him. The klaxon kept screaming, smoke curling in from the hall, and Lyra grabbed her sword, springing up with a grace that belied the chaos. The blast had sealed them in. A wall of twisted debris blocked the exit, trapping them in a narrow pocket of the workshop. "We're stuck," she said, her voice tight, scanning the wreckage. Victor coughed, waving away the haze, and spotted a tangle of exposed wires sparking near the floor. "Power's still live," he said, crouching to get a better look. "If I can reroute it, maybe we can shift this junk." Lyra nodded, stepping closer, her armor brushing his shoulder as she watched him work. He reached into the mess, fingers brushing her waist by accident as he stretched for a loose cable. She froze, her breath catching, a sudden jolt racing through her that had nothing to do with the explosion. "Don't move," he murmured, his voice low and steady, focused on the wires. Her pulse kicked up, hammering against her ribs, and she felt a shiver crawl down her spine, not from fear, but from the warmth of his touch lingering against her side. He didn't notice, too busy twisting the cable into a makeshift splice, but she did. Her eyes flicked to his face, then back to his hands, steady despite the trembling world around them. With a final tweak, a panel shuddered open a crack, letting in a sliver of smoky light. They squeezed through, emerging into a tight, debris-choked corridor, the station still groaning under its own weight. Lyra brushed dust off her arms, her gaze lingering on him as he shook out his hands, muttering about sore wrists. "That slab, He shouldn't have held it. Not with those skinny arms. Not without breaking something. And that light in his eyes again, brief but real. She'd seen it, felt it in the air like a static charge. He wasn't just some tinkerer. He was hiding something, even from himself. Victor glanced at her, catching her stare, and frowned. "What? I got us out, didn't I?" he said, rubbing his neck a little defensive. She didn't answer, just stepped over a fallen beam, her boots crunching on shattered glass. The corridor stretched ahead, dark and unstable, faint tremors rumbling through the walls. Victor fished the hollow device from his pocket, its screen cracked but still glowing, and thumbed it on, squinting at a flickering map of the station. Lyra moved beside him, her shoulder brushing his again as she peered at the screen, her breath steadying but her mind still spinning, piecing together the mystery of the man shuffling along next to her. Victor hunched over the cracked hollow device, its faint glow casting jittery patterns across the debris-strewn corridor. The station's tremors had settled into an uneasy hum, but the air still tasted of smoke and scorched wiring. Lyra stood close, her armor scraping faintly against the wall as she peered over his shoulder at the flickering map. He tapped the screen, muttering about glitchy tech, then swiped to a page from the Celestial Chronicles that had popped up unbidden. "This thing's out of mind of its own," he said, half to himself as the text scrolled to a story he'd read a dozen times. A warrior, some nobody from a backwater moon, waking up one day with a power he couldn't explain, strength that bent steel and shook the ground. He glanced at Lyra, catching her golden eyes glinting in the dim light. "See, this guy," he started, voice rough from the dust. He didn't even know what he had. Just went about his life, fixing carts or whatever, until some warlord came knocking. Then, bam, he's tossing boulders like they're pebbles. He chuckled, a dry, uneven sound, and shook his head. "Sounds ridiculous, right?" Lyra didn't laugh. She leaned in instead, her black hair brushing his shoulder, a soft tickle against his jacket that made him twitch. Her scent, something sharp and metallic, mixed with a hint of storm-charged air, hit him, and he froze for a second, fingers hovering over the hollow. "You're more like him than you think," she said, her voice low and teasing, a thread of amusement weaving through it. Her hand drifted up, fingertips grazing his arm where he'd gripped that slab of steel earlier. Light as a whisper, but deliberate. Victor's breath hitched, and he let out a nervous laugh, pulling the hollow closer like a shield. "Hey, don't mess with my gear," he said, his tone half joking, half flustered, but she didn't pull back. Her fingers lingered, tracing a slow line along his sleeve, and he felt heat creep up his neck, his usual ease slipping away under her touch. She smirked, those golden eyes locking onto his, bright and playful in a way that didn't match the warrior who'd nearly sliced him in half. "Mess with it?" she echoed, leaning closer until her hair brushed his cheek now, a dark curtain that sent a shiver through him. "I'm just testing it. Like I tested you." Victor swallowed, shifting on his feet, the hollow device wobbling in his grip. "Yeah, well, I'm not some hero," he muttered, glancing down at the screen where the warrior's tail blinked in jagged pixels. I don't know, got lucky back there." But his words sounded thin, even to him, and Lyra's smirk widened, like she'd caught him in a lie he didn't know he was telling. She liked this, poking at him, watching him squirm. It was a game now, a spark of fun she hadn't felt in years, cutting through the dull weight of her usual fights. His awkwardness was almost charming, the way he ducked his head and fumbled his words, so different from the braggarts she'd crushed in the pit. But there was more to it, a warmth blooming in her chest, soft and unexpected, as she watched him try to dodge her teasing. He wasn't just a puzzle anymore. He was starting to feel like something she wanted to unravel, piece by stubborn piece. Victor didn't get it. Why she kept hovering, why her eyes stayed on him like he was worth the attention. She was a warrior, all sharp edges and deadly grace, while he was just a guy who patched leaks and dodged bar fights. Yet here she was, close enough that he could feel the heat off her armor, her fingers still resting on his arm. He cleared his throat, forcing a grin. "You're gonna break this thing if you keep distracting me," he said, tapping the hollow to switch back to the map, but his voice came out shakier than he meant. Lyra's laugh was soft, a rare sound that cut through the station's drone, and she finally eased her hand away, though her gaze didn't waver. He rubbed his arm where she'd touched him, the spot tingling faintly, and squinted at the map again. "Okay, so, this says there's a maintenance shaft up ahead," he said, pointing a blinking line. "Might get us out of this mess." Lyra tilted her head, her hair sliding over her shoulder as she studied the screen, then him. "Might," she repeated, her tone still teasing, but she stepped back, giving him space barely. "Lead on, then hero." He snorted, shaking his head, and started picking his way through the rubble, the hollow's light bouncing off the walls. The corridor twisted ahead, narrow and cluttered with fallen panels and sparking cables. Victor ducked under a sagging beam, muttering about shoddy welds, while Lyra followed, her boots crunching on the debris. She kept her pace slow, deliberate, her eyes flicking between the path and his back, that spark of warmth still flickering inside her as he grumbled about the station's upkeep, oblivious to the way she watched him move. Victor picked his way through the rubble, the hollow device cracked screen casting a shaky glow over the twisted corridor, while Lyra shadowed him, her boots crunching on glass and metal shards. The station's groans had softened, but an uneasy tension hung in the air, thick as the smoke still curling from the wreckage. Far beyond Orion 9's battered hull, on the storm-swept plains of Cormoran, Tarsus brooded in his command spire, a towering figure clad in black armor etched with jagged runes. He was no mere warrior. He was the iron fist of Cormoran's military, a strategist whose name sent shivers through even the boldest ranks. His eyes, cold and gray as slate, burned with a hunger that went beyond conquest. He wanted power absolute, and Lyra was the key. She wasn't just a fighter to him. She was the linchpin to the eternal flame, a weapon buried deep in Cormoran's core, a relic of their ancient wars said to burn out stars with a single pulse. Only a champion of her caliber could awaken it, her blood and will tied to its dormant heart. Tarsus had watched her for years, waiting for the right moment to claim her, to bend her to his vision of a galaxy remade in ash. But then came the fight in Orion 9's pit. A fluke, a nobody mechanic knocking her down with a strength that shouldn't exist. Word reached him fast, carried by spies lurking in the station's underbelly, and his interest sharpened into obsession. Victor wasn't just a nuisance. He was a threat, an unknown variable that could unravel everything. He wasted no time. From his spire, he barked orders, his voice a low growl that rattled the chamber's stone walls. "Find the off-worlder. Bring him to me alive." A bounty hit the networks, a fortune in credits flashing across every smuggler's screen from Orion 9 to the outer rims. Victor's face, grainy and unassuming, tagged with a price that turned heads. Tarsus didn't stop there. He dispatched his hunters, mercenaries with scarred faces and plasma rifles, Cormoran enforcers with blades as cruel as his own. Orion 9 shuddered under their arrival, docking bays clanging open as ships disgorged armed squads into its maze of corridors. The station was no longer a haven. It was a battlefield, its residents scattering or arming up, caught in the chaos of his hunt. Victor didn't know any of this yet. He ducked under a sagging conduit, the hollow device buzzing as he traced the maintenance shaft's path. "Almost there," he muttered, brushing soot off his sleeve, his voice a rough thread in the quiet. Lyra stayed close, her sword sheathed but her hand resting on its hilt, every sense tuned to the faint vibrations rippling through the walls. She'd fought under Tarsus once, years ago, before his ambition twisted into something darker. She knew his methods, ruthless, precise, and the thought of him targeting Victor sent a chill through her she-didn't voice. "Keep moving," she said, her tone clipped, scanning the shadows as they pressed deeper into the station's guts. The air grew heavier, laced with the tang of burnt circuits and fuel. Footsteps echoed somewhere distant, a rhythmic thud that wasn't the station settling. Victor paused, frowning at the sound, but Lyra nudged him forward, her shoulder brushing his as she took the lead. Not our problem, she said, though her grip tightened on her sword, her mind flicking to Tarsus's banner, a flame-wreathed skull she'd once saluted. The shaft loomed ahead, a narrow chute half-blocked by a fallen grate, its edges jagged and glinting. Victor knelt to pry it loose, his fingers working fast, while Lyra stood watch, her silhouette tense against the flickering light, the distant clamor growing sharper with every passing second. He wrestled the grate free, its metal screeching as he shoved it aside, revealing a dark chute dropping into the station's lower levels. Lyra slid in first, her armor scraping the sides, landing with a soft thud in the belly of a derelict ship, a rusting hulk docked for scrap, its hull pocked with holes. He followed, tumbling out with less grace, the hollow device clattering beside him. Safe for now, he panted, brushing dust off his knees, but the words barely left his mouth before a pulse of light cut through the gloom, a scanner beam sweeping the hold, followed by the clank of boots on steel. Lyra yanked him behind a crate, her sword flashing out as three figures emerged. Mercenaries, their rifles humming, visors glinting red. They moved like wolves, fanning out with practiced precision, their leader barking orders in a guttural snarl. "Spread out, flush him!" Lyra didn't wait. She lunged, her blade a streak of blue fire, slicing the first merc's rifle in half before he could fire. Sparks flew, metal clanging as she spun, driving her elbow into his jaw. He crumpled, but the others were faster, unloading a barrage of plasma bolts that scorched the crates and forced her back. She ducked low, her breath sharp, her sword deflecting shots with a high-pitched whine. Victor crouched behind her, heart pounding, muttering, "I'm no good at this," as the air filled with the acrid sting of burnt ozone. The second merc closed in, a hulking figure with a vibro axe, swinging it down in a brutal arc. Lyra parried, but the force knocked her off balance, her boots skidding across the deck. The third flanked her, rifle raised, and she couldn't dodge both, not this time. Victor saw it, a split-second blur, and something snapped inside him. He lunged, no plan, just instinct, tackling the rifleman with a yell. They hit the floor hard, the gun skittering away, but the axeman turned, roaring as he charged Lyra again. She was pinned, her sword locked against his blade, and Victor, still sprawled, grabbed a jagged slab of wall plating, hurling it without thinking. His hand flared, a faint glow pulsing through his fingers, and the metal flew faster than it should, smashing into the axeman's chest with a sickening crunch, crumpling him against the bulkhead. Lyra broke free, finishing the rifleman with a swift kick, then spun to Victor, her chest heaving. He sat there, staring at his hands, the glow gone, his breath ragged. How did I do that?" he stammered, flexing his fingers like they might explain themselves. She didn't answer, just grabbed his arm, pulling him down as another scanner beam swept through, its light grazing the crates. They flattened against the floor, her chest pressed to his back, her breath hot against his neck, mingling with his in the tight space. The beam passed, and she eased off, her hands lingering as she checked him for wounds, finding a gash on his arm from the scuffle. "Hold still," she said, tearing a strip from a nearby rag, her fingers brushing his skin as she wrapped the cut. Her touch was firm but gentle, sliding over the blood-streaked muscle, and he caught her hand for a heartbeat, his pulse jumping under her grip. She met his eyes, steady and sure, that flicker of want stirring deeper now. He wasn't just a mystery. He was something extraordinary. Victor looked away, rattled, but a thread of trust wove through the confusion, anchoring him to her. "Thanks," he mumbled, rubbing the bandage as she pulled back, her fingers flexing like she'd felt the same spark. The ship creaked around them, distant shouts echoing through its hull. Lyra retrieved her sword, wiping it clean on a fallen merc's cloak, while Victor scooped up the hollow device, its screen blinking with static. He stood, wincing at the ache in his arm, and glanced at the shadowed passage ahead, the sounds of pursuit still drifting closer through the maze of steel. Victor slumped into the pilot's seat of the derelict ship, The cockpit a cramped nest of frayed wires and blinking gauges, the air thick with the tang of rust and sweat. Lyra settled beside him, her armored thigh brushing his as she leaned in, her presence filling the tight space like a storm held back by glass. The shouts of Tarsus's hunters faded into the hull's creaks, giving them a fleeting breath after the fight. She rested her hand on his leg, firm and deliberate, her fingers pressing through the fabric of his torn pants. "You're not ordinary, are you?" she whispered, her voice a soft blade, cutting through the hum of the ship. Her golden eyes searched his, flickering with something raw and unguarded. He caught her hand, his grip shaky but warm, his thumb brushing her knuckles as he held her there. "I don't know who I am," he said, voice low and frayed, like he was admitting it to himself for the first time. Their gazes locked, a heat sparking between them, fierce and unspoken, lighting up the dim cockpit. Lyra felt it, a pull, a need to dig into him, to peel back the layers of this man who'd stumbled in her world and turn it upside down. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, the warmth of his touch seeping into her skin, making it hard to keep her walls up. She wanted to lean closer, to feel more, but she held still, caught in the tension of it. Victor's chest tightened, his fingers tightening around hers for a heartbeat longer than he meant. He could smell her now, metal and storm, sharp and alive, and it stirred something in him, a tug he couldn't name. He wanted to pull her in, to close the gap and let whatever this was crash over him. But his mind spun, wrestling with the urge. She was a warrior, all fire and steel, and he was just him, a guy with a busted hollow and hands that did things he didn't understand. Her hand stayed on his thigh, steady and bold, and he swallowed hard, his free hand fidgeting with the edge of the console. "Guess we're stuck here a minute," he muttered, glancing at the flickering controls, trying to break the weight of her stare. Lyra's lips twitched, a faint smirk tugging at them, but she didn't move her hand, her fingers flexing slightly against his leg. The cockpit's lights pulsed, casting shadows over her jade skin, and she tilted her head, watching him fiddle with a loose switch, her breath brushing his ear as he leaned forward to check a gauge. Victor flipped the switch, the cockpit shuddering as the ship's engines coughed to life, a weak rumble that carried them away from Orion 9's chaos. Lyra guided him through the controls, her hand lingering near his, until they crash-landed on a desolate planet, a wasteland of cracked earth and skeletal ruins, its sky bruised with purple streaks. Dust billowed around the wreck as they climbed out, the air biting and dry, but the silence didn't last. A shadow loomed on the horizon, Tarsus, his black armor glinting like oil, flanked by a squad of enforcers. His voice boomed across the plain, cold and commanding. "You can't run forever, Lyra. And you, off-worlder, your time's up." He'd brought the fight to them, his prize within reach. At the center of the ruins stood the eternal flame, a towering spire of dark metal, its core pulsing with a faint, ominous red. Tarsus raised a gauntlet, activating it, and the ground trembled as energy surged, the weapon waking with a low, menacing hum. Lyra drew her sword, its blue glow flaring, and charged, her boots kicking up dirt as she met his enforcers head-on. Victor ducked behind a slab of stone, heart pounding, watching her carve through them, slashes and spins, a dance of lethal grace. But Tarsus was different. He met her blade with his own, a massive cleaver sparking against hers, driving her back with brutal force. She stumbled, her guard cracking, and Tarsus seized the opening, slamming her into a crumbling wall. The spire's hum grew louder, its core glowing brighter, a countdown to ruin. Victor's chest tightened, panic clawing at him as he saw her pinned, Tarsus's blade inches from her throat. "No!" he shouted, sprinting from cover. No plan, just desperation. An enforcer intercepted him, swinging a plasma mace, but Victor dodged, grabbing a jagged pipe from the ground. His hand shook, then steadied, a heat flooding through him, his eyes igniting with a fierce, radiant light. He swung, and the pipe didn't just hit, It shattered the mace, sending the enforcer sprawling with a force that cracked the earth. Tarsus turned, snarling, and Lyra broke free, but the spire's core was pulsing faster, a heartbeat of destruction. Victor ran for it, Tarsus roaring behind him. "You'll die first." A cleaver swing grazed his shoulder, blood seeping through his jacket, but he didn't stop. Cornered at the spire's base, the core's heat searing his face, he felt it. A surge, wild and unstoppable, erupting from deep inside. His fists clenched, glowing bright, and he slammed them into the core. The metal buckled, then split, a deafening crack splitting the air as the red light flickered out, the weapon collapsing in a shower of sparks. Tarsus staggered, his armor smoking, and fell to his knees, defeated by a blow no one saw coming. Lyra limped over, her sword dragging, and stopped beside him, staring at the wreckage. Her eyes caught a faint rune on the shattered core, curved lines like those in the Celestial Chronicles, the mark of a lost bloodline. She turned to Victor, breathless, realization dawning. He was no accident. He was the last of that legendary clan, his power their legacy. He wiped sweat from his brow, wincing at the gash on his arm, and kicked a loose shard of metal aside, muttering about needing a bandage, while Lyra sheathed her sword, her gaze lingering on him as the wind howled through the ruins. The wind howled through the ruins, kicking up swirls of dust around the fallen spire, its shattered core still sparking faintly in the wreckage. Victor leaned against a jagged slab, catching his breath, the sting of his torn shoulder dulled by exhaustion. Lyra stood a few paces away, her sword now sheathed, her jade skin streaked with grime and sweat as she stared at him, the weight of her realization sinking in. Tarsus lay crumpled in the dirt, his grand plans snuffed out by Victor's raw, impossible strength. The silence between them buzzed, heavy with everything unspoken, until she stepped forward, her boots crunching over broken stone. She reached him in 3 strides, her hand lifting to his face, fingers brushing his cheek, rough with stubble and blood. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent, trembling with a mix of awe and need. Her golden eyes bored into his, searching, demanding. Victor's breath hitched, his hand catching hers against his skin, holding it there as he met her gaze. "I don't know," he said, his voice a low rasp, cracked from the fight. "But I need you." The words slipped out, unguarded, and something snapped loose inside them both. She pulled him close, her other hand fisting his jacket, and their lips crashed together. A fierce, hungry kiss, all teeth and heat, born from the chaos they'd survived. They stumbled back, the momentum carrying them down to the cracked floor, a tangle of limbs amid the debris. His hands slid into her hair, threading through the dark strands, tugging gently as he deepened the kiss, tasting the salt and fire of her. She pressed against him, her armor digging into his chest, her fingers digging into his shoulders like she'd never let go. Lyra's heart pounded, every wall she'd built crumbling as desire surged through her, wild and unstoppable. He was her match, her fate, etched in that rune on the core, in the way he'd fought, in the way he held her now. She'd known strength, but this was different, a pull that lit her up from the inside. Victor let go of doubt, of the questions spinning in his head, swept away by her, by the feel of her under his hands, the sound of her breath hitching against his mouth. She was a storm, fierce and alive, and he was caught in it, every nerve sparking as he pressed closer, his lips trailing along her jaw, her neck. She arched into him, a low sound escaping her throat, and he felt it vibrate through him, fueling the fire that had been smoldering since she'd first pinned him with those eyes. The ruins faded, the wind a distant roar, as they clung to each other, hands roaming, seeking, the world narrowing to just them. She pulled back just enough to catch her breath, her forehead resting against his, her fingers tracing the edge of his torn sleeve. "You're bleeding," she murmured, a flicker of concern cutting through the haze, but he shook his head, grinning faintly. "Worth it," he said, voice rough, and she laughed, a short, bright sound that echoed off the stones. He tugged her back down, kissing her again, slower this time, savoring the way she melted against him. Her hands slid under his jacket, palms warm against his sides, and he shivered, the ache in his shoulder forgotten as he lost himself in her touch. They shifted, rolling slightly to avoid a sharp chunk of rubble, settling into a hollow between the stones. Victor propped himself on an elbow, brushing hair from her face, his fingers lingering along her cheek. Lyra caught his wrist, holding it there, her breath steadying as she watched him, that fierce glow in her eyes softening into something deeper. "We should move," he said, glancing at the ship's silhouette against the bruised sky. But his tone lacked urgency, his thumb brushing her skin. She nodded, barely, and leaned up to kiss him again, quick and firm, before pushing to her feet, dusting off her hands as he scrambled up beside her, the heat between them still simmering. Victor kicked open the hatch of the wrecked ship, the interior dark save for the faint starlight filtering through a cracked viewport, painting slivers of silver across the floor. Lyra followed, her sword clanking as she set it against the wall, her fingers already working the clasps of her armor. The plates fell away with soft thuds, revealing the smooth, jade shimmer of her skin, glinting like a gem in the low light. She turned to him, her hair spilling over her shoulders, and Victor stepped closer, drawn in, his hands finding her waist as he pulled her into his arms, the warmth of her body cutting through the chill of the metal around them. His fingers slid up her shoulders, tracing the lines of muscle and curve, steady but reverent, and she tilted her head back, a sigh escaping as he kissed her neck, slow and deliberate. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice a husky thread, her hands gripping his jacket to tug him closer. His lips lingered, tasting the salt on her skin, his breath hot against her throat as he pressed himself against her, the tension of the day unraveling in every touch. She guided him down, sinking to the floor, pulling him with her until they were a tangle of limbs, her legs hooking around his, her nails grazing his back through his shirt. The scene blurred, fading to the quiet aftermath. They lay stretched out on the cold deck, hands clasped tight, fingers laced as sweat glistened on their skin under the starlight's glow. Lyra's chest rose and fell, her breath steadying, as she turned her head to look at him, a playful glint in her eyes. "You're stronger than any hero in that book," she teased, her voice soft but edged with a grin. Victor chuckled, a low rumble, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "And you're the reason I fought," he said, his tone warm, his thumb tracing her knuckles as he shifted closer, the ache of the battle fading into the comfort of her beside him. Her jade skin caught the light, a faint sheen highlighting every curve, and he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the stillness. She squeezed his hand, her fingers strong and sure, and rolled on her side, propping herself up to glance at the scattered armor nearby. "We'll need that soon," she murmured, nodding toward it, but made no move to get up, her free hand brushing lazily along his arm. Victor stretched out beside her, wincing slightly as he flexed his shoulder, the bandage from earlier still holding, and reached for the hollow device tossed a few feet away, its cracked screen flickering as he pulled it closer.